And welcome back to Square Off. Arizona author Jeremy Duda covered the history of treason in America in his book, If This Be Treason. Well, treason is back in the news again with speculation about what Donald Trump Jr. may or may not have done. Jeremy Duda is back with us this morning to give us his insights. Jeremy, also an editor at the Arizona Capital-Times. Great to see you again. Before we get to the Trump situation, let's start with the Constitution. Treason is the only crime defined in the Constitution. Why did the founders put it there?
Well, because of the way that the concept of treason had been so applied in such a heavy-handed way by the British, so they felt really misapplied and abused. To define anything that kind of offended the king. They wanted to make sure that future generations in an independent United States would never be subject to that kind of arbitrary application. So they made sure to put this in the Constitution. Congress can change the penalties for this. They can never change the definition, though, except for a constitutional amendment. They wanted to make sure that this was ironclad, can't be changed, that it could not be changed just to include things like offending the government or opposing government policies.
It's not just dissent. It's got to rise to a certain level. And Congress is the only body that can bring a charge of treason. Is that right?
Not sure about that. I think the same as the court system for any other crime, I believe.
Okay, just constitutional scholar Bram Resnick here, just doing my interpretation. Now, the language is important. It consists only in levying war against the United States or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. So, is Donald Trump Jr. getting close to that aid and comfort or not?
Oh, most certainly not. I mean, the very narrow definition here, obviously levying war against the United States, there's nothing like that in anything he's admitted to or been accused of. But you get to the aid and comfort, adhering to its enemy's part. And the way this has always been interpreted is to have an enemy, you need to have a war, you need to have hostilities. Obviously the United States and Russia, they are not on the friendliest of terms and haven't been for some time. But to call them an enemy legally, that would be a bit of a stretch. You have to keep in mind that throughout the 40+ years of the Cold War, we had, there were Americans who were convicted of, colluding with the Soviet Union, of passing secrets to them. I think we had, the Rosenbergs who gave them atomic secrets, were hanged for that, charged with espionage, not with treason. Why? Because even though the Soviet Union was obviously, in the more colloquial term, an enemy of the U.S., no hostilities with them, no fighting with them. We had full diplomatic relations. They were therefore not an enemy.
So when has treason been applied?
World War II. Most of the last cases, there was one about 10 years ago for an American who had joined Al-Qaeda, but prior to that, you hadn't seen any actual treason cases in this country since the World War II era. The last indictment and conviction, I believe, was the late 40s, maybe early 50s, stemming from an American citizen's activities in Japan during World War II.
So let's talk about a fascinating story in your book, because you profile many of these cases in the book as well as the history. Presidential election, 1968, a candidate who used an advisor to make a back channel to an enemy. Right?
Actually, a back channel to a friend, getting
a friend to
undermine, the Lyndon Johnson's peace efforts.
So this was Richard. Step back and just give us a summary of the story. It's candidate Richard Nixon trying to get an edge in his race against Democrat Hubert Humphrey by using a back channel to South Vietnam. To do what? What was going on?
Right. Well, 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced he wasn't going to be running for re-election, horribly unpopular because of the war. He really wanted to at least get the peace process started before he left office. It was very important to him. Nixon was very concerned that this was going to happen because this would help the pro-peace candidate, the peacenik candidate Humphrey. And Nixon was concerned that Johnson was going to use the war as a kind of a political tool to help Humphrey out. There's a lot of talk that he'd start a bombing halt that would kickstart the peace process. When Nixon found out this was actually going to happen, Johnson had finally gotten the North Vietnamese to agree to his terms. He started using a woman named Anna Chennault, a Republican operative and fundraiser, China lobby member who he'd been using as kind of a back channel to the South Vietnamese government.
It was called the Chennault Affair.
Yeah, the Chennault Affair. And he was using her as a back channel to the South Vietnamese government through its ambassador to the U.S. And he instructed her, and she therefore instructed Saigon to basically stonewall Johnson in these peace efforts. They had agreed, South Vietnamese President Thu, he had agreed to these peace talks in Paris just a few days before the election. Johnson was about to announce this, agreed to it, and right as Johnson was getting ready to make the announcement, he started balking at it.
So Johnson said, "This is treason." Sent it to an advisor. This is treason. Why wasn't it treason?
Oh, he was using treason more in I think kind of the general colloquial term that we hear so often, especially in the political world. But in terms, and people use that, of course, to mean kind of more sedition or betraying the country in some way. Certainly, Johnson believed this was betraying the U.S., betraying its interests. He was trying to get us out of a war. Americans were dying every day, and here was Nixon trying to prolong that war to win an election. Okay,
and years later, it did come out in H.R. Haldeman's papers.
Yeah, this just came out about 6 months ago. A historian named John Farrell was writing a biography of Nixon, Nixon the Life, fantastic book, by the way. Came across these notes in Haldeman's papers from the 1968 campaign. It had never been seen by anyone outside of the Nixon circle, where he was taking notes on Nixon's instructions, saying, throw a monkey wrench, get Chanel to throw a monkey wrench in this, anybody else to stop this.
So Nixon knew 40+ years later.
Absolutely.
There's the evidence.
Yep. The smoking gun that Lyndon Johnson never had.
Fascinating story. The book is If This Be Treason. Jeremy Duda is the author. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Bram.